So hi everybody, I'm Steve Zubiago and I'm the Managing Partner and Chief Executive Officer of Nixon Peabody. So the practice of law is centered on people, and interactions with people are always based on communication. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Charles Duhigg today. Charles is a Pulitzer Prize winning author and speaker on communication. He is an expert in the science and the thought behind how to effectively communicate. His most recent book is titled Supercommunicators. Charles has joined us at our partners meeting and made a presentation to our partners that was very effective and very helpful in moving us forward. So I'm pleased to be joined by Charles today. Charles, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Steve. This is such a treat for me.
So Charles, I'd like to start by just having a conversation about understanding origins. So people's occupation is always very interesting to me. I am the proud son of a police officer and a medical secretary. I ended up being a lawyer. I understand you've got an interesting family background. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so both of my parents were lawyers. My dad in particular was a trial lawyer in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I and my 9 siblings all grew up. And one of the things that I loved about being the child of a lawyer, and in spending time with Nixon Peabody, I think that I saw this in your firm. To be a lawyer is to be a super communicator, right? It really is it's not about combat. It's about finding out what the other person really wants and needs. And of course, when we put it that way, it's not just about law or being a lawyer. That's what most of life is. That when we're managers in any kind of a firm, from technology to energy to medicine, whether we're stay-at-home parents who are trying to figure out why our kids are unhappy or what we can do to help them, so much of what we do, so much of the meaning that we find in life comes from connecting with other people. And we do that through conversations and through communication.
Yeah, I love that point about connecting. But before we go deeper on that, I've got to ask. So tell us about communication among 9 siblings. Everybody wants.
Well, there's a lot of, let's just say it was loud and somewhat chaotic, and you definitely had to learn how to get your own voice in there, right? If you're too quiet, if you're too meek, then you're not gonna get the last slice of dessert or what you want for Christmas. So you definitely learn all of the tricks about how to make sure that your voice is heard, which doesn't mean you're the loudest, and it doesn't mean you're the most outgoing, but it means that you understand what you need to do.
So I had a friend in college. He was the youngest of 5, and he always used to eat off my food tray, when we were in the cafeteria. And I was like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm the youngest of 5. If you want something, you gotta grab it." And I'll never forget that. So the point about using communication to connect, when you spoke to our partnership, that came through really, really strongly. So how do people do that? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and it's worth exploring what actually happens in our body and our brains when we're in a conversation, because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication like never before because of advances in neural imaging and data collection. When we're in a conversation, a real conversation, a conversation where you connect, this conversation, for instance, our bodies start to change. Without us realizing it, in this conversation, our heart rates are starting to match each other. Our breath patterns are starting to match each other. Even though we're on opposite sides of the country and we're doing this over the internet, the dilation of our pupils is beginning to echo each other. And if we could see inside our brains, what we would see is that as the conversation unfolds, my thought patterns and your thought patterns become more and more similar. Literally, the electrical activity within our brains begins to achieve some type of simultaneity, to mirror each other. And that makes sense when you think about it, because if I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually feel that emotion a little bit. Or if I tell you about an idea, you experience that idea. Within neuroscience, this is known as neural entrainment. And it's the point of communication. It's what makes us feel closer to each other. It's an evolved capacity because we're pro-social creatures. And as a result, our brains actually give us a reward sensation when we connect with other people. So at the core of all the tactics that super communicators use, and all of us are super communicators at one time or another, at the core of those tactics, of those techniques, is achieving this sense of connection, this sense of understanding of each other, because it makes us feel closer to each other. It makes us trust each other more. It makes us more persuaded by each other, and it makes us listen more deeply.
So I've had the benefit of hearing you give this explanation before, and since I've heard it, I've been trying to utilize it, and I look for those cues to try to understand if the person, if we're connecting on that level. But how about go the other way? So if you're having a conversation and you're not feeling that level of connection, what can you do to try to create it? Because you've been very clear that creating that connection is what gets to the higher level of understanding.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And miscommunication happens all the time, right? We want to connect, but we're having trouble doing so. One of the big mistakes that people make is that when we're in a discussion, we often think we know what that discussion is about. We're talking about where to go on vacation next week, or the budget for next quarter, right? Or we're just talking about our day. But when researchers look inside our brains at our neural activity as we're having that discussion, what they see is that we're actually having many different kinds of conversations, all at the same time. And these kinds of conversations, they often fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're making plans together or we're solving problems. But then there's the next bucket, which is emotional conversations, where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize with me. And then there's finally social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and society, the identities that are important to us, how we see ourselves. And what researchers have found is that all three of these conversations are all equally legitimate. But if people are having different kinds of conversations at the same moment, that's when miscommunication occurs. Think of going home and talking to your spouse, and your spouse tells you about a tough day they've had, that they're not getting along with their boss, and they're kind of venting, and you say, okay, here's how you solve that problem. And they say, no, I don't want you to solve my problem, right? I'm having an emotional conversation. You're having a practical conversation. This isn't working. Like, I want you to match me on the emotional level. And in fact, in psychology, there's become what's known as the matching principle, which says that successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And so one of the things that supercommunicators, or the best communicators, do is they learn techniques, and we can talk about these, about how to match other people so you're having the same kind of conversation, or invite them to match you so that you get aligned. Because once you're aligned, then you can move from the emotional to the social to the practical back to the emotional together, and you feel connected.
So interesting. So if you're in a conversation and you don't feel the matching, you're not connecting, the step is to take a step back and think, what kind of conversation is this person
Absolutely.
expecting?
Absolutely. Take 10 seconds and just think to yourself, okay, look, it feels like we're like two ships passing a night. We're not connecting with each other. What's going on here? So look at, for instance, their body language. Mm-hmm. Are they transmitting to you that they're feeling a certain way? Even if the words coming out of their mouth sound practical, are they frowning? Are they crossing their arms? Are they sort of moving back from you, looking skeptically? Listen to the words they use. If they use words like, I feel like this budget is really unfair to me. Okay, we might think that a budget is a practical conversation, but they're using emotion words. They're talking about unfair. They're talking about how they feel. Listening to those subtle hints can tell us this person is actually in an emotional conversation mindset, and I need to acknowledge that before I can ask them if we can move on to the practical together.
So a technique would be, in that scenario, to ask somebody, tell me how you're feeling, or rather than explain your position, tell me why you feel that way.
Yes. Asking questions is fantastic, and that's actually the second tactic. And and those questions can be really straightforward. When I come home and I start complaining about my day, my wife will often say to me, do you want me to help you figure out a solution for this? Or do you just need to get this off your chest and vent? In other words, do you want a practical conversation or emotional conversation? And of course, I love her asking that, because I can say, no, this isn't that big a deal. We don't need to solve it. I just want you to I just need to get it off my chest, right? I need to vent. So we can ask that question about what kind of conversation we're in as we're looking for those clues. But there's other questions we can ask too. And this is the second important tactic of supercommunicators, is that they tend to ask more questions than the average person, like 10 to 20 times as many questions. And some of those questions are pretty easy questions. Like, they're questions designed to invite you into a conversation. Things like, oh, what'd you think about that? Or, oh, what'd you say next? But some of the questions that they ask are what are known within psychology as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks me about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, right? To ask someone to do that. But it's as simple as if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of asking them, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, what made you decide to become a doctor? Right? That second question, it's an invitation for someone to tell you about their values, to tell you about the experiences they had growing up. It's an invitation to get deeper. And so you're exactly right. Asking that question lets me figure out what kind of conversation is happening and what kind of mindset the other person is in.
Okay, so let's go a little deeper on that. So
Okay.
one of the techniques that I've heard you talk about is showing vulnerability. So
Yeah.
talk to me about how that can be used to deepen a connection.
Absolutely. And then I want to ask you about vulnerability as a lawyer. Vulnerability is critical to conversations, but most of us misunderstand what vulnerability is. We think of it as like crying on each other's shoulders or, talking about our moms. Vulnerability has a very specific definition in neuroscience. It's a neural cascade that occurs when I tell you something that you could judge. Now, I might not care about your judgment. I might tell you that I like Star Trek better than Star Wars. And you think that's the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your entire life. And I don't care. It's not that big a deal. But the act of me telling you something that you could judge, it triggers this automatic impulse that lives in all of our heads, which is I'm going to pay very close attention to how you react. And if, at that moment, if you decline to judge me, if you withhold judgment, even more importantly, if you share something about yourself that I could judge in return, then suddenly we trust each other more. We feel closer to each other. That's why vulnerability is so important. Vulnerability emerges when I say something you could judge. And if you withhold judgment, if you share something about yourself that I could judge, if you get a little bit vulnerable, then suddenly, even if we disagree about each other, we're voting for different people, we're arguing over different budgets, suddenly we will feel closer to each other and will trust each other more. Which brings me to the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, as a lawyer, you're dealing with opposing counsel all the time, and you're dealing with adversarial situations. How do you find that you use vulnerability as a connecting technique when someone's across the table from you?
Yeah. So in the practice of law, it's difficult because you're always trying to demonstrate to the other side that you're in control, you're in command of the facts, you're in command of the law, you're in command of the process. And sometimes when you're communicating with your own clients, you want to meet their expectations, and so there's a hesitancy to let your guard down.
Yeah.
And I'm a transactional lawyer, not a litigator, but it applies in transactions as well. There's always a point in time in a negotiation where you have to let your guard down and meet halfway or meet a quarter away and figure out how you're going to do that. And what I do as a technique, and now my conversation with you have helped me understand the thought process of why I was doing it, I guess, instinctually, is when I wanted something to get resolved, I always tried to go first and take the risk and make myself vulnerable. And, say, well, if we did this, that would mean this and that. How would you react to it? So try to build trust by being the first mover to move the conversation along. And I always, in my mind, instinctually thought that gave me credibility. Now, the careful thing is figuring out what the right time to do that is,
right,
and how vulnerable to make yourself. So that's how I've always thought about it. And what my conversations with you have given me some science and some thought process behind that.
And what I love about that is, again, instinctually, you're taking advantage of this capacity that's evolved in our brains, right? This is a product of evolution. It's what makes humans pro-social, which is, you're exactly right. When you take that first step, when you're willing to say, I'm willing to walk across the bridge, not too early, not in a way that it's like too much information or it makes it appear like you're needy, but when you're willing to say, look, I respect your strength and I respect my strength, and I'm willing to sort of let my guard down a little bit, what you're doing is you're triggering in the other person, as well as in yourself, this capacity, this instinct that's evolved over millions of years to say, if they're letting their guard down, then it means I'm safe to let my guard down a little bit too. And without that, humans never would have become humans, right? We would have never, the reason, if you think about it, communication is our superpower. It is what sets humans and Homo sapiens apart from every other species. And the reason why that's so important is because when we communicate, we can become pro-social. We can build families and villages and towns and law firms and aircraft carriers and video game consoles. Communication is what makes humans special. And so taking it, recognizing those instincts, using those instincts, utilizing them to connect with other people, it's the most human thing you can do, even if you're in an adversarial legal situation.
Right. So let's talk about the reaction that you get from when you make yourself vulnerable, something happens. And I love your story about NASA and about the thought process of NASA interviewing the people to be astronauts. Tell the audience about that.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite stories from supercommunicators. A number of years ago, NASA confronted this big problem, which is they were going to start sending people up into space to live on the space station. And so they were going to start sending people up for like 3 months or 6 months or 12 months at a time. And up till then, their longest missions had been about 10 days. And they had discovered you can send the biggest jerk on Earth into space for 10 days and it's going to be fine, right? Like they're going to pick fights with mission control. They're going to pick fights with each other. It's fine. But 6 months or 12 months, if you send a jerk up into space for 6 months or 12 months, he's going to drive everyone crazy, right? She's going to make everyone totally insane. So they start saying, look, we need to start choosing a new kind of astronaut. We need to find astronauts with emotional intelligence. And so they turned to this guy, the head psychologist for NASA, and they asked him to figure out the right interview questions to ask candidates to find astronauts who have emotional intelligence. And for like 6 months, he works on this. Can't figure out anything. There's no secret question. There's no like special. And then one night, he's listening to old recordings of previous candidates, and he knew which of them had been selected and had become real leaders within NASA, and which of them had kind of washed out. And as he's listening, he realizes that the guys and the women who became real leaders, they're laughing differently than everyone else in their interviews. So he comes up with this brand new way of interviewing. What he does is he asks the astronaut candidate to come in and have a seat. The psychologist walks into the room. He's holding this big stack of papers, and he trips as if on accident, and he spills the papers everywhere. And then he goes like this. I cannot believe I just did that. I am such a klutz. And then he pays attention to how the candidate reacts. Because everyone reacts in one of two ways. Some of them react by going, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. And some of them react by going, that is really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. Because they know what's going on, right? There are these situations where we make a mistake, like we spill papers everywhere. And then in our embarrassment, we compound the mistake by overreacting to it. We laugh this big boisterous laugh. We do something that's like kind of like silly and embarrassing. And some of the candidates say, you know what? I'm just going to help you sweep that under the rug. I'm going to pretend that didn't happen. But other people say, I know what you're feeling. And in order to make you feel better, I'm going to react the same way you did. I'm going to match you. I'm going to overreact just like you did to say, look, I'm jumping in the kayak next to you. I know what this is like. Those were the candidates with emotional intelligence, and those went on to be some of the best leaders in NASA's history.
It's a tremendous story. So let me ask you, so the people that reacted and laughed and matched,
Yeah.
do you think that was intentional learned behavior, or is that kind of an innate, comfortable reaction?
It's interesting because what we know from studies is that if you ask them, about half of them will say it's innate and half will say, I've learned this. But the truth of the matter is it's a learned behavior for all of them. Sometimes people don't recognize it. If you talk to the best communicators, there was like this whole, for a long time we figured the best communicators were probably people who had the gift of gab. They were extroverts. They had always been good at communication. They were born that way. But if you talk to the best communicators and you ask them, have you always been good at this? They'll inevitably say no. They'll say stuff like, in high school, I had real trouble making friends with other kids. So I had to really study how kids talk to each other. Or my parents got divorced when I was young and I had to be the peacemaker between them. Mm-hmm. What we know about communication is it's an entirely learned skill. Mm-hmm. And being a super communicator, being a great communicator, it's just built on a small number of skills that you can practice and you can learn and practice until they become habits. And there's no one who's born great at communication. There's just people who pay a little bit more attention to communication who become great at it.
So extroverts might have some level of comfort, but that doesn't mean they're better communicators. And introverts, on the other hand, might have some level of discomfort, but with a little understanding and a little training and a different approach than the extroverts, they could be good communicators too.
Absolutely. I mean, think about how many times you're at a party and there's some clear extrovert in the corner who's just like talking a mile a minute and he's bigger than life. And you're like, I don't want to go talk to that guy. It seems exhausting. I'm going to go talk to this other person who's like sitting on the couch by themselves because they look interesting and they might be a little bit quiet, but like they want to have a real conversation. Extroversion, introversion, it doesn't matter. What does matter is wanting to be better at communication. If you want to be better at communication, you will get better at communication.
So Charles, you've written other books besides Supercommunicators, and they have very cool titles. I want to talk about them a little bit. So the first is called The Power of Habit. Tell us what inspired you to write that and what that's all about.
So I was at the New York Times when I wrote The Power of Habit, and I had this basic question, which was, if I'm so smart and so talented, why can't I lose 10 pounds, right? Like, why can't I get myself to get up in the morning and go for a run when I know that I should, or to say no to that dessert? And so what I did is I said, look, if I write a book about this, then I can call a bunch of experts and ask them for advice on how to improve my life. And the thing that they told me was really fascinating. They basically said, look, there's a science between habits, right? You're making this mistake that everyone makes. You're thinking a habit is about a behavior. But actually, every habit has three parts. There's a cue, which is a trigger for that behavior to start. Then there's a routine, which is the behavior itself. And then finally, a reward. Every habit in your life delivers a reward to you, whether you're aware of it or not. And they said, what we've discovered is that most people, they focus on the behavior. They focus on the routine, right? That's what Aristotle and Oprah and everyone talks about. But if you focus just as much on the cues and the rewards, then it's a lot easier to change bad habits or to create new ones. And so I thought that was fascinating, and that's where the book came from.
Yeah, that's great. I've read your book and others, and I've found it powerful in my professional life, and then it also was helpful in your personal life. But you know, as training as a lawyer, when I started, I got some really simple guidance about how to get through your day and how to handle things, and I've followed those, and I've really found that those habits give me a routine and give me and so when things get crazy, it's like, well, this is what I do. I do this and I do that, and you follow your process, and I found that to be very, very helpful.
And I imagine that as someone who was a practicing lawyer and now is as much, if not more, of a manager, now that you're the CEO of the firm and the managing partner, I imagine you've had to change your habits to respond to the new kinds of demands that life is putting on you. Have you found that? Like, and has it been deliberate? How does that work for you?
It has been deliberate. So I've been in this position for 5 years now. And the way I explain it to my friends is at 54 years old, I got a completely new job that requires completely different skills, some of which are apparent, some of which still aren't apparent. But I got to work with the same group of people in an industry that I think I know a little bit about and understand. But as a lawyer, you're very much a doer. You're either going to do something directly or you're going to direct somebody to do it, and it's very action orientated. And now in my position, there's very few things I actually do directly, and most of the things I do directly are kind of interpersonal, one-on-one types of things. Whereas I have to be, much slower in my process, much more process orientated, take more input, just kind of be slower, give direction. There's a lot of things we want to accomplish. You can't do all those by yourself, so you got to empower people. It's been very, very different, and I think the overall habit has been slow down and listen And when you don't think you're listening enough, listen more. Like you can't listen enough.
It's really interesting to hear you say that. There's this saying that I love, kind of in the communication world, which is, if you're feeling furious, get curious. Which is a kind of extreme example of what you just said, which is when you're feeling upset, when you're feeling out of your depth, when you're feeling this person's complaining to me and I just want to get them to quit complaining, the answer is to ask them more questions, right? And which is obviously listening, because I'm asking those questions so that I can hear what you have to say. And there's something really important about listening. And this is actually the next skill that we know super communicators do really, really well, is not only do they listen really well, they prove to you that they're listening, right? So there's this kind of theory that that you should, close your mouth and open your ears. And that's an important first step of listening. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to what listening really is, it's much more active than just passively sitting back and letting the other person speak. You have to show them that you're hearing what they're saying, that you're thinking about it, that you're absorbing it. And there's actually a technique for this that they teach, particularly in conflict situations, right? Inside companies when there's people fighting about budgets or whatever it is. Or just conversations around the dinner table with relatives who might have voted for someone else than you voted for. It's called looping for understanding, and it has 3 steps. Step 1 is that you should ask a question, preferably a deep question, right? Something that asks about their values, their beliefs, or their experiences. And then let them answer the question. Don't interrupt them. And when they're done, repeat back to them in your own words what you heard them say. The goal here is not mimicry. The goal here is not to convince them, the 3 or 5 or 7 points they made. The goal is to prove you're paying attention and you're thinking about it. So you can say things like, oh, you mentioned this thing before, and I see it kind of links to this thing you just said. Or you can ask a follow-up question, which is a way of showing that you're listening, and say, hey, I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile this and that? So that's step 1 and step 2. Ask a question, repeat back what you hear them say. And most of us, by the time we're adults, we've learned to do this sort of intuitively. It's step 3 that I always forget, which is once you have repeated back what they say, ask if you got it right. Did I hear you correctly? Am I understanding what you're trying to say? Because in that moment, when I ask you if I got it right, what I'm actually doing is I'm asking your permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And one of the things that study after study shows, particularly in workplaces, is that if you acknowledge that I am listening to you, you become much more likely to listen to me in return. Mm-hmm. And so this proving that we're listening, asking those questions, saying there's always more questions that I can ask, and then showing people that you're paying attention, that you're thinking about what they're telling you, it's incredibly powerful. It's actually been found to be the most powerful technique in resolving conflicts within workplaces.
So listen, repeat it back, and then ask if you got it correctly.
That's exactly right. Looping for understanding.
And
you just did a great job of it, by the way.
And so that's what I was trying to show. So if you do that, you've established a connection and you've established trust. Now I'm going to be provocative.
Okay.
Will that land and stay consistent even if you're not agreeing on the topic?
Absolutely. In fact, it won't necessarily make you agree on the topic, right? We just celebrated Thanksgiving. If you sat down with your crazy Uncle Gary, who thinks that lizard people are running the country, mm-hmm. you're not going to agree with him and he's not going to agree with you. But the goal of that conversation is not to convince each other that the other person is wrong. The goal of that conversation, the goal of every conversation, is simply to understand what the other person is trying to say. Right. And if you feel like I actually want to understand what you have to say, and I feel like you want to understand what I have to say, if we feel like we've connected in that way, if we're having the same kind of conversation, if we're asking each other deep questions, we're still going to walk away ready to vote for our own guy or disagreeing with each other about which religion is best or which sports team should win. But we'll feel connected to each other. And if you think about those moments in our nation's history that we are proudest of, they are not the moments when everyone agreed with each other. If you think about the Constitutional Convention, it was this group of guys who got together who all, for the most part, hated each other. And all they did was argue for month after month after month. But They were able to write a constitution together. The times that our country is at its best is not when we agree with each other. It's when we want to understand each other, because that understanding, that connection, that makes it easier for us to disagree and still coexist.
A great example of that is how the country reacted after 9/11.
Absolutely.
And pulled together. And unfortunately, there's so many examples where that are not positive right now. But if these techniques were used more and more by people, that might enhance the level of common understanding. It might not bring everybody together on every issue, but it would at least give a chance to increase the level of understanding and better communication and respect for different points of view.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in those moments, if you think about it, those deep questions and proving that we're listening can be so powerful. If you're sitting down next to Uncle Gary and he's saying crazy things, and you ask a deep question like, Uncle Gary, I know you've talked about this a couple times. Just tell me a little bit, why is this so important to you? Like, why does this why does this matter so much to you? Mm-hmm. Inevitably, what he's going to say is something deeply human. He's going to say something like, oh, the reason I voted for this guy for president is because I feel like people have ignored me. That it's just harder for me to succeed than it was for my parents to succeed. And I don't like that. Right. And that's something that all of us can relate to, even if you voted for someone else, even if you don't agree with his political stances. You understand what that feeling feels like. And that's a place where you connect. And that doesn't mean you're going to walk away and vote for the same person, but it does mean that you feel closer to each other. And it means that we're going to trust each other a little bit more. And frankly, that we're more likely to listen to each other.
Yeah, that's super strong. So Charles, it's been great to speak with you. I'd encourage all our listeners to give your books a peruse. They're super interesting. You've given us some good techniques for how to communicate better, things that could help us in our professional life and our personal life. And I love this ending. This was super strong. We're not here to solve all the nation's problems, but certainly if some of your techniques could be put into place, people could get to a higher level of understanding, and that would be good for all of us. So I thank you very much for your time, and I enjoyed this.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It is always such a delight to visit with you. I really appreciate it.